Hello, buddies. Hi, Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming here, with a JMulls Explains for the day. With the recent influx of subscribers and viewers to the channel, a lot of the comments I've received about why people really enjoyed Final Fantasy XIV's story is character-related, and the characters are just so well written that they really enjoyed them. And it got me thinking, what is it about the Final Fantasy XIV characters that make them so enjoyable, so engaging? What is it about the writing process for Final Fantasy XIV, or the presentation, that makes these characters so well designed? And I thought today I would take a minute to go into detail about why I think they are so well written. Let's begin. Alright, so we are in the city of Ishgard. It's a beautiful city, ain't it? But it's also a good microcosm of all that I enjoy about the character design and character development in Final Fantasy XIV, because a lot of it happens here in Ishgard. And it continues on with the Ishgard Restoration, which is the crafting and gathering content for Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers. I'm not going to go into spoilers specifically about certain story beats, so if you do not know the story of Final Fantasy XIV, you don't need to worry about that. This video should be safe here. So let's start off with item number 1 on the agenda here. Characters aren't killed for no reason. Have you ever played a game, read a story, watched a movie or something like that, where once a character's story or development seems to be done, they're just killed off? In my opinion, a lot of the times that's just kind of lazy, because you took the time to write actual development and character for that character's individual story, but you didn't write anything after that. There's no epilogue, there's no sense of what happens afterwards for that character, because the character dies. But in Final Fantasy XIV, sure, characters die in the game, but they are killed off for reasons, for purpose, that actually further the story and further the stories of other characters. They aren't just killed off just to try and elicit a cheap emotional response from the player. That's not why Final Fantasy XIV kills off characters. And for other characters, they'll go through major beats of character development and still come out on the other end of it alive. What that does, and they're not just shunned away and put into the closet to save for a rainy day, like an Illidan or something like that. Or, you can pick almost any other character from almost any other game. I said almost for a specific reason, because there are some exceptions to this rule. But when a character's story is done, they're not just ignored and thrown to the wayside to be completely forgotten about and just to be for that story. No, they come back, and you constantly see, especially with Ishgard, the development of every character, and you see the resultant of that character development. You see Ishgard and the characters in it change from what you did in Heavensward, and it's still happening in Shadowbringers with Ishgard Restoration. A lot of them are present in some sort of side quest activity or side content like raiding, and it gives them more time to be on the screen. So even after their current development, they are still in the game in some capacity. Maybe they're thrown into a side quest, or maybe they are thrown into a raid story, or maybe they just come back in the main story quest later on. But you see the actual resultant of that character development, which makes that character development all the more potent and memorable, because you can see how that character changes from the beginning all the way to the present, and you see how the changes that character endured affects other people around him. It's really well designed in that way, because it requires effort on the writing team to not just throw characters away and write new characters for the current story. They write new characters, but it's also a matter of they don't just completely ignore the old characters. They bring them back, but you already have this relationship you developed with them over the course of your adventures. You understand their motivations, what fuels them, what inspires them, and what drives them, and what changed them as people. And you still see the resultant of that action. And then when new characters are brought into the fold, maybe those old characters that already had that development can be used to also further development of those new characters. So it's a nice cycle there. Final Fantasy XIV also knows how to pace its story. I addressed this before in a previous video, but it's so good. And it knows when characters need to have quick and bombastic hyped up moments, and when the game needs to just slow down and let you deal with each character's emotional state and how they feel, and how they were affected by various situations and by the events of the game that had just transpired. Shadowbringers and Heavensward are phenomenal in this regard. And actually, Stormblood as well. I'd be amiss not to mention Stormblood here. Final Fantasy XIV just handles pacing so well. Because it never feels like it's just dragging on for no reason. If a certain section is slow, or doesn't have any big plot moments, it's used for character development and for understanding how characters think and feel in these current situations, and how these events that are transpiring around them are altering their characters, how they're thinking, how they feel, how they view other characters. You get motivation, you get desires, you get development. And that's what grips players and what grips me into the story. By having these engaging characters that have enough time in the main story and in these side quests to be able to breathe and to feel normal and natural within the confines of the game's world. And another thing is, the game is not just one tone throughout, it knows when it needs to mix up the tone. And like I said before with the pacing, it knows when to be fast and bombastic and really hype, and it knows when it needs to slow down and be some more somber. But it also knows when it needs to inject comedy into the plot, so it doesn't always feel serious. It mixes up the tone to keep the player engaged, but it also puts the characters themselves into different tonal stylings, so that we, the player, see these characters react to different things, which is important because it gives because it makes the character feel multi-dimensional instead of just paper thin or two-dimensional. So we see how these characters react to different things. Even if a character isn't a complete goofball, we can still see them in comedy bits that don't overstay their welcome by having that character juxtaposed with characters that are more humorous in nature. There's a particular pairing and with Y'shtola and Matoya, and if you know what I'm talking about, you know exactly what I'm talking about with that pairing. It's brilliant in how they handle it. Because yes, these scenes still are serious and they still feel important, but they know when to slip in the comedy to mix it up a bit, and to just also show you how these characters can think differently other than, I have one purpose and I will do this one purpose. Oh no, I can take the time to laugh, I can take the time to feel embarrassed, I can take the time with these characters can take the time to feel emotions, which makes the player and the viewer more engaged with these characters. And for villains, it would be amiss of me not to talk about villains in Final Fantasy XIV, because they're freaking brilliant. Across the board, I love them. Many of them may be sympathetic, but they're still villains at the end of the day. But you can understand where they're coming from, and why they think like they do. You just don't have to agree with them. And that's an important thing, because it's not just a matter of morally gray where, yeah, this person really had a point. It's like, yeah, I can understand where they would come from, how they arrived at their recent understanding of the world, and for their motivations. It doesn't mean they're right. And that's important because the game's not justifying their actions. It's informing you that what led to their decision making, what that character values, and how they react to things. It builds character, and it makes you care more about these characters, because some characters are just completely villainous, and some will not act completely villainous. It gives you a wide array of different types of villain archetypes, but it also makes them all feel unique, because they take the time to let these characters just talk, and to react to different things, and to tell you their motivations, and why they think these things, and why they believe what they believe. It isn't just a matter of me bad. It's a matter of, I do not like this world because of X reason. And then you'll be like, huh, that's actually kind of, I can see where they're coming from, but again, I kind of have to save the world here. And the game, if you haven't gotten this from the video up to this point, this game is not afraid of character development. Each character changes throughout the story, from a realm reborn to the present day, and it changes based on what they went through and what they learned and what they continued to go through. And that's really important to me, and it's really powerful because it gives you a wide, vast array of characters that all have had development, that you care about all of them. And it makes the world feel like a world and not just some small segment of it. It gives each land personality because you understand the characters, what their motivation is, you understand the geopolitical structures of the worlds, and you understand how that influences various people. It's brilliant storytelling, in my opinion. And one of the reasons Final Fantasy XIV can do this is because of just how long the story is. You have A Realm Reborn, you have Heavensward, you have Stormblood, and now you have Shadowbringers, and will soon, in 6 months, have Endwalker. And by having all that time, they can focus on individual characters and certain parts, develop those characters, move on to more characters while still retaining some of the old characters, and it's just a process that keeps on going. Because characters never really stop developing. They are reacting to the never-changing and developing world of Eorzea and Hydaelyn. And to me, while you can't get a lot of the development you get in Final Fantasy XIV in, say, like a 2-hour movie, just because you're restricted time-wise, so you have to narrow your focus down to specific characters, etc., etc., etc. Why do a lot of people like the Marvel movies and the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Because there's so many of them. But each movie allows you to develop certain characters that come back later on, and you can see the resultant of that character development later on. It just makes you care more about these characters, because they give you enough time to be able to interact with them, and for them to be able to change, and for them to be able to interact with other characters that are also changing. It's really well done, because the story never feels like a slog either. And we go back to the pacing element of the storytelling itself, to constantly keep the player engaged. Because it knows when it needs to be really hype, and it knows when it needs to be predictable. That's another thing. In my opinion, a lot of writers feel like they need to be unpredictable when they write a story, because the general preconception is that if your story is predictable, then it's inherently flawed. That's not necessarily true. You're going to have predictable elements of the story, just if those predictable elements make sense, and there are some elements in Final Fantasy XIV's story, and in Shadowbringers as well, that were predictable, but they're so freaking awesome, and the payoff is so freaking good, where Square Enix is not afraid to be predictable for moments like that, because that's the payoff you're looking for, and they will give you that payoff, and they will tear away your heart, and they will give you hope again, and they will tear it away from you. Because they know how to write a story. And particular shout out to Ishikawa here, because she wrote the Dark Knight story, which I already did a separate short about why the Dark Knight story is so good. Because in my opinion, it's a perfect microcosm of Final Fantasy XIV's storytelling. And she also, I believe, is the head writer for Shadowbringers. I believe she's also writing Endwalker as well. Because she understands these elements. Because Shadowbringers, in my opinion, is not just one of the best stories in Final Fantasy XIV. It's one of the best stories in gaming, period, bar none. There's only a few I can think of, maybe, that are probably worthy of videos in their own right. But the stories that Square Enix and the developers of Final Fantasy XIV are able to weave and to craft here is so good and it's so immersive, because they know how to use their characters, and they know that if you ever listen to one of George R. R. Martin's interviews, right, he will talk about various writing stylings for characters, and either have a blueprint for, okay, I want these certain events to happen, and I have to fill in the gaps to get there. With Final Fantasy XIV, it feels different. With Final Fantasy XIV, it feels like, okay, we're going to put these characters in a world, and the story develops based upon how these characters are interacting. Because their interactions with one another feels logical based upon how you have learned about the personalities and the characteristics and what they value. It feels natural, and the flow is really good in my opinion. So yeah. Why are Final Fantasy XIV characters so well designed? It's a combination of a multitude of various writing strengths that Final Fantasy XIV's story has. From phenomenal use of pacing, not being afraid of character development, knowing when they need to be unpredictable, but when they also need to be predictable, to give you nice payoff moments and also give you really good surprise moments. They know how to tell a cohesive and fluid and understandable story that started in A Realm Reborn and continues to the present day. And it's one fluid story. It's not one separate story that feels like it's chopped up into multiple pieces. No, this feels like a continuing story. They know how to keep the player engaged. They know when to bring characters back into the main story. And they know how to just write good dialogue as well. It's a multitude of many things that just come together to create a cohesive whole that, in my opinion, is greater than the sum of its parts. Because Final Fantasy XIV's story is so good. And it's not just because the world's engaging, but the people that inhabit that world are also engaging. Final Fantasy XIV is not afraid to kill off characters, but it's not afraid to keep characters around. When they feel that by having those characters around, they can tell a better story. And in my opinion, that's a fine line they walk, but they walk it beautifully. So, that's this episode of JMulls Explains. I hope I got my thoughts across relatively well. Thank you all for tuning in. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe and comment down below if you liked the video and you want to see more content. I know I would appreciate it. Stay safe out there, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye everybody. A smile better suits a hero.